The chamber smelled like something old. Not old the way libraries are old, or old the way a grandfather's coat is old. Old the way stone is old, when it has been pressed under an ocean for 1,000,000 years, and has forgotten what water feels like. The air in the chamber of accord on Galactic Council Station Varith 9 was recycled through systems that had been running before humanity had learned to write things down. It tasted like patience, like waiting, like something that had already decided how everything was going to end. Delegate Yusra Okafor Ndi sat in a chair that was too wide for her. Everything in the chamber was too wide for her. The table was too long. The ceiling was too high. The seats around the curved council ring were built for bodies that came in shapes a human tailor would not know how to measure. 43 species, 43 kinds of bodies, some with too many limbs, some with none at all, just floating masses of organized tissue that moved like water finding a lower place to be. Yusra did not look at them. She looked at the Vreth. There were 3 of them at the reading podium. The Vreth always came in 3s to formal proceedings. Nobody was sure if it was religious or procedural, or just habit. Nobody had ever asked, because the Vreth were the oldest diplomatic mind in the known galaxy, and asking them why they did things felt like asking a mountain why it was tall. They had coral white bones that showed faintly through the translucent skin of their 7 limbs. When they moved, the limbs moved together the way a single thought moves through a brain without conference, without delay. The eldest one, Sorath of the 9th Coil, was reading. He had been reading for 40 minutes. His voice was not a voice the way human voices are voices. It was more like a chord played on an instrument with no name, each frequency carrying a different layer of meaning. The translation chip behind Yusra's left ear worked hard and hot. She could feel it. She did not move. Sorath was reading the sanction of diminishment, the official document that the Galactic Council had spent. She knew this. She had counted 11 months preparing. 11 months of closed sessions and back-channel communications and quiet agreements traded between species who never agreed on anything except, apparently, this. Humanity was being demoted. That was the polite word the translation chip gave her. Demoted. Tier 2. Recognize civilization to Tier 4. Protected ward. In practical terms, it meant humanity would lose its vote in resource allocation. It would lose its right to maintain a standing military fleet. It would lose the ability to sign treaties without council oversight. It would, in the language of the document Sorath was reading, be placed under the collective guardianship of the more developed and more stable civilizations of the known galaxy for the protection of interstellar peace and order. It meant the council had decided that humanity was a problem that needed a cage, a polite cage, a cage with very nice filing systems and proper bureaucratic language, but a cage. Sorath read a clause about the decommissioning schedule for human military vessels. He read a clause about the appointment of council observers to Earth's governing bodies. He read a clause about restricted jump lane access. His chord voice never changed pitch. It was the same at the beginning as it was now. Calm, thorough, the voice of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. Yusra wrote something in her notebook. It was a paper notebook. Actual paper. She had brought it from Earth. The sound of the pen on paper in the huge, silent chamber was the smallest sound in the room, and she made it very deliberately. The Jessie delegate to her left shifted. The Jessie were tall, four-armed, their skin the greenish-gray of deep water. They looked at the notebook the way people look at something they cannot decide whether to find offensive or simply strange. Yusra did not look back. She wrote another line. Sorath came to the final clause. He read it without ceremony because the Vreth did not do ceremony the way younger species did. Ceremony, to the Vreth, was just information delivered slowly. He simply read the last words of the sanction and let them sit in the air of the chamber the way a stone sits in water. The words meant, "This is what you are now. This is what we have decided. There is a process by which you may appeal, but the process takes 90 standard years, and the outcome of the process has historically been the same as the original decision, so you may want to consider whether the energy is worth it." The chamber was quiet. 43 species waited for the human delegate to react. Yusra clicked her pen. She did it the way her hands used to move in surgery. She had been a trauma surgeon for 11 years before she was anything else, and her hands had learned something in those years that the rest of her had never completely unlearned. In a room where everything is going wrong in ways that cannot be fixed, the hands find something small to do. something controllable. The motion of the hands is not panic. It is the opposite of panic. It is the part of the brain that is already solving the next problem, while the rest of the room is still understanding the current one. Click, click. She closed the notebook. She capped the pen. She put both of them in the inside pocket of her jacket, which was a very plain, dark jacket that she had chosen because it would photograph clearly in the chamber's official record and be legible to anyone watching later. She stood. She thanked the counsel in Vrethcord. Her pronunciation was not perfect, but it was respectful, and among the Vreth, respectful mispronunciation was considered more dignified than perfect pronunciation delivered without care. She had spent 3 months learning this specific phrase of thanks, specifically for this moment. She walked out. Her aide, a young man named Dio who had been sitting 2 rows behind her and who had not blinked in 40 minutes, followed her into the corridor. The corridor outside the Chamber of Accord was long and pale and lit with the blue-white light the station used in administrative sections. It made everyone look slightly ill. Dio looked more than slightly ill. He caught up to her and kept his voice low even though the corridor was empty. What do we do? Yusra was looking at something ahead. The corridor ended in a viewport. Beyond the viewport was space, which was very dark and very full of things that had not yet been decided. She looked at the viewport for a long moment. Then she looked at the pen in her hand. She did not remember taking it back out of her pocket. Tell Admiral Chen Vasquez, she said, that the council just answered our question. Dio opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What question? Yusra put the pen back in her pocket. She walked toward the viewport, and the blue-white light caught the side of her face, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for something to become simple, and it just had. She did not answer Dio. He had not been cleared for the answer. Not yet. 3 hours later, in the station's diplomatic quarters, Yusra sat at a small desk and wrote a report. Not for the council, not for Earth's public feed. A report for a file that existed in a server that did not appear on any network map because it had been built inside the architecture of a maintenance log for a water recycling system on the station's sea deck, and the person who had built it there had retired quietly 8 years ago, with a very good pension and a very clear conscience about the whole thing. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she sent it. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about a conversation she had had 14 years ago in a small room in Nairobi with 3 people who are not mentioned in any official record of that year. The conversation had been about a question, a very specific question that the 3 of them had decided needed answering before anything else could be decided. The question was, if we gave them a reason, a clean reason, a legal reason, a reason nobody could argue with, would they actually do it? For 14 years the answer had been, we don't know yet. Now Yusra knew. She looked at the viewport in her quarters. Different angle than the corridor. Same dark space beyond it. Same stars that had been there before humanity had crawled out of its own atmosphere, and before the Vreth had ever heard of a planet called Earth. She thought about the sanction of diminishment, about the 90-year appeal process, about the clause on military decommissioning. She took out her pen. Click, click. She was not scared. She had not been scared in a long time. What she felt was something that does not have a clean name in any language, the feeling of a very long string pulled tight and then, finally, released. Not snapping, releasing, becoming purposeful. She thought about Admiral Priya Chen Vasquez, who was at this moment sitting in a room on Earth that did not officially exist, eating whatever the cafeteria had made that day, watching 43 screens with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific phone to ring. It was ringing now. Yusra did not envy the council what came next. She did not hate them, either. She understood them. They were old and careful, and they had looked at humanity. The way you look at a fire you don't know is controlled not with malice, just with the instinct to put a wall between yourself and something that makes you uncertain. They had built the wall. They had handed humanity the blueprint, the material, and the workers. They had called it a cage. In 11 months of closed sessions and very careful legal work, not one of those 43 species had thought to ask what humanity had been doing in the years before this moment. Not one of them had looked at the long quiet of human diplomacy, the concessions, the agreements, the patient nodding, and asked what kind of mind is patient for that long and why. They had seen a species that was too loud in the dark between stars. They had not looked at what the loudness was covering. Yusra capped the pen. She started making a list of things she would need to pack. The diplomatic quarters would need to be vacated. She would do it correctly, with all the proper checkout procedures and signed forms, because that was important. The forms were always important. The Vreth had built the galaxy's bureaucracy over 3 centuries, and it was very thorough, and Yusra respected thorough work. She was going to use every single piece of it. Outside the viewport, a human freighter moved through the station's outer shipping lane. Slow, polite, running all its required signal lights. She watched it for a moment, then she went back to her list. The facility did not have a name on any official document. It had a maintenance code. It appeared in the Nairobi Orbital Platform's infrastructure registry as a water recycling support node, which was technically accurate the way that calling an ocean a puddle is technically accurate. It involves water, and it involves a container, and that is where the accuracy ends. The facility had 43 screens. It had a cafeteria that served food nobody was going to write a review about. It had 12 staff, then 40, then 209 over the years, all of them hired through processes so carefully indirect that even the people doing the hiring could not have drawn you a clean line from their own actions back to the place they were building. It had been built in the gap left by a filing error in 2089. Someone at the United Nations Space Command had made a clerical mistake that created a 17-square-meter registration blind spot in the Nairobi Orbital's official floor plan. The person who found the error had 2 choices. Fix it, which would take about 20 minutes, or look at it for a long time and think about whether a blind spot the size of a large room in an orbital platform above the most diplomatically active city on Earth was the kind of thing you fix. She had not fixed it. She had also retired very comfortably 8 years ago, and on the day she retired she had shaken Admiral Priya Chen Vasquez's hand for slightly longer than a standard handshake, and no words had been exchanged, and none had needed to be. Admiral Chen Vasquez was sitting in the facility now. She was eating rice. The cafeteria made rice every Tuesday and Thursday because someone had decided years ago that rice was a unifying food, cheap, neutral, requiring no strong opinions to consume, and the Admiral ate it without complaint, because she had learned 40 years ago in her first naval posting that the fastest way to lose a room full of people's trust was to complain about the food. You ate what was there. You focused on the work. Everything else was detail. She was watching 43 screens. Each screen tracked a different thread: diplomatic communications, fleet positioning, resource flow maps for 6 of the galaxy's major supply corridors, signal traffic from stations she was not supposed to know the internal schedules of, and absolutely did know the internal schedules of, because knowing things you were not supposed to know was the entire job. One screen was blank. It had been blank for 11 minutes. The 11 minutes were not an accident. They were not a malfunction. They were a signal. A very specific signal that meant a very specific thing, which was, the council voted, it went the way we thought it would go, and now we know what we needed to know. The blank screen filled. It was a text-only message, no voice, no image, just words on a screen that technically did not exist in a facility that technically did not exist on a platform above a city that very much did exist and had been diplomatically central to human affairs for over a century. The message was 7 words. Admiral Chen Vasquez read it. She smiled. The smile was the kind of smile that the 12 junior staff in the room registered without looking directly at. The kind of smile that made people's hindbrain say something important is happening and my job right now is to not be in the way of it. Not a cruel smile. Not even a happy smile. Exactly. The smile of someone who has been waiting for a very specific answer to a very specific question, and the answer has just arrived. And it is the answer they prepared for, which means the preparation was correct, which means the next 14 steps can begin. She put down her fork. Get me Vashra, she said to the room in general. Commander Vashra Pillai was 29 years old, which in this facility made her one of the younger members of the team, and she had the particular quality of appearing to already know what you were about to ask before you finished asking it, which Chen Vasquez had identified as useful within 48 hours of Vashra joining the staff, and had been cultivating ever since. Vashra was at her side in 4 seconds. Pale measure, Chen Vasquez said. That was all. Vashra nodded once, and walked to a second bank of terminals on the far wall, and began doing things that would take 3 days to fully explain, and that had been prepared for and rehearsed so thoroughly over so many years that her hands moved through the process the way hands move through, something practiced without hesitation, without visible thought, the body doing what the mind had already finished with long ago. Operation Pale Measure had not been named after anything dramatic. It had been named by the same woman who had chosen not to fix the filing error in a meeting that happened before there was a facility to have the meeting in. She had been a strategy analyst then, in her mid-40s, with the dry humor of someone who had spent 20 years watching powerful people make decisions based on bad information, and had developed a professional allergy to optimism that lacked structure. She had named the operation after an old phrase, pale, measure, the thin line of something, just enough to matter. The idea behind it was not complicated. Humans had been in space long enough to understand one thing clearly. The species they shared the galaxy with were older. Most of them were bigger. Some of them had technology that made human engineering look like children building with blocks. In a direct fight, weapons against weapons, ship against ship, humanity would lose. Not immediately, not without taking a significant number of other people down with them, but lose. So Pale Measure was not about fighting. It was about understanding how wars actually end, not how battles end. Wars. And the analyst had gone back through every conflict humanity had ever documented, its own and others, every war in the galactic record. The Council had grudgingly shared, and she had found the same pattern every time. Wars do not end when one side runs out of soldiers. Wars end when one side runs out of the willingness to keep paying the cost, when the price of continuing becomes higher than the price of stopping. So the question Pale Measure was built to answer was not, how do we win? It was, how do we make the cost of fighting us so large, so permanent, and so present in every corner of the enemy's daily existence, that the war ends before it fully begins. Not with destruction, with math. Chen Vasquez stood at the main screen now. The star map was up. It was a map of the 6 major supply corridors that connected the Council's Tier 1 civilizations to the resource systems they depended on. 6 corridors. 43 choke points across those corridors where traffic was dense enough and alternatives limited enough that a disruption would be felt within days. She did not plan to disrupt anything. She looked at the map for a long time and thought about a word she had been keeping in a specific part of her mind for 14 years. The word was patient. She had been patient. The whole apparatus behind her had been patient. 209 people who knew pieces of the plan, who had spent years preparing pieces of the plan, who had filed correct paperwork and attended correct meetings and eaten whatever the cafeteria made on Tuesdays and Thursdays, all of them patient. The Council had handed them the reason. Clean, legal, undeniable. The sanction of diminishment, read aloud in the official chamber, by the Vreth's own eldest diplomat, in a session recorded in the full official record. Humanity had been told it was too dangerous to be free. Chen Vasquez thought about what happens to something that has been told it is too dangerous to be free. She thought about a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, its own worst ideas about itself. A species that had crawled out of one rock and reached for every other rock it could find, not because someone told it to, but because something in its nature could not look at a distance and see anything other than a problem to solve. She thought about what that species does when it is finally, clearly, legally given a reason. 6 freighters, she said. Vashra looked up from the terminal. 1 to each corridor choke point, Chen Vasquez said. Civilian class. Full registration. All lights on, all transponders active. Every piece of paperwork correct and filed in advance through the proper channels. She paused. Tell them to be polite. Vashra wrote it down. She did not ask why. She had read enough of the Pale Measure documentation to understand that the politeness was not a tone. It was a weapon, a very specific kind of weapon that leaves no mark and no defense because you cannot shoot at something that is doing nothing wrong. And the message? Vashra asked. Chen Vasquez looked at the map, at the 6 points she had just marked, at the supply lines that 43 civilizations had built over 2 centuries and that ran through those points the way blood runs through a body, not optional, not decorative, simply necessary. Tell them, she said, that we'd like to renegotiate our docking fees. She said it the same way she ate the cafeteria rice. Matter of fact, no drama. The tone of someone doing a job that needed doing. She picked up her fork. "And send my compliments to Delegate Okafor and DI," she added. She held that room for 40 minutes and walked out with everything we needed. Vashra nodded. She started the process. The freighters had been positioned for 9 months. Their crews had been briefed in pieces, each person knowing only the portion relevant to their role. The paperwork, the docking applications, the fee schedule revisions, the formal notifications to each station authority along each corridor had been drafted and redrafted and checked again, and now it was filed, in the correct systems, through the correct channels, with all the correct reference numbers. 43 civilizations had just voted to put humanity in a cage. Humanity had filed the paperwork to park 6 polite, unarmed, fully compliant civilian freighters at the places those civilizations could least afford to have anything at all sitting still. Chen Vasquez ate her rice. On the screens around her, the signals began to move, slow, correct, visible to anyone monitoring because they were supposed to be visible. Humanity was not hiding. Humanity had never been hiding. Nobody had been looking in the right direction. Outside the facility's single window, which faced the wrong direction on purpose because Chen Vasquez had not wanted a nice view distracting anyone from the work, the orbital platform hummed along above the city. Below, Nairobi moved through its day. Markets and meetings, and children going home from school, and the ordinary weight of a planet going about its life. She looked at the screen. She thought about the question again. The one Yusra's message had answered. If we gave them a reason, would they actually do it? Yes. It turned out the answer had always been yes. They had just been waiting for someone to make the reason official. The freighters did not move. That was the first problem. Not the biggest problem. Not even close to the biggest problem, as it would turn out. But it was the first one that the Council's Logistics Division brought to the attention of the Council's Security Division, which brought it to the attention of the Council's Diplomatic Oversight Body, which brought it to a closed emergency session of the full chamber, 8 weeks after the sanction of diminishment had been read and filed and considered finished. 8 weeks. The Vreth considered this response time somewhat hasty by their standards. The younger species in the chamber did not share this view. The freighters had arrived at the 6 corridor choke points 6 days after the sanction was issued. They had arrived with all their lights on and all their paperwork in order, and a very pleasant automated greeting message that ran on loop through standard communication channels. The message introduced the vessels by name and registration number, explained their business, and included a politely formatted document revising the docking and corridor access fee schedule that had been in place for 30 years. The new fee schedule was not illegal. This had been checked. This had been checked by the Council's own legal division, which had spent 4 days looking for the part where humanity had made a mistake and had not found it because there was no mistake to find. Humanity had helped write the galactic trade law. They had been in the room when the fee structures were built. They had agreed to terms that were favorable to the larger civilizations because they had been a small presence in the galaxy then, and because being agreeable had cost them nothing they could not afford to lose at the time. Now the fee schedule revision was also agreeable. Politely formatted, properly filed. It was just much higher. The Jesse Military Command had sent a communique to the 6 vessels within 48 hours of their arrival. The communique used language that stopped short of a military order by a very thin margin. It told the freighters to move. The freighters replied with 17 pages of cited galactic trade law. The Jesse Command did not have a prepared response for 17 pages of correctly cited galactic trade law. Because nobody prepares a response for something like that. It takes a specific kind of mind to look at a situation that looks like a military problem and understand that it is actually a paperwork problem. And militaries are not generally structured around that kind of thinking. The freighters stayed. More arrived over the following weeks. Not at the choke points, at the stations adjacent to the choke points. At supply depots and maintenance platforms along the corridors. At every place where the traffic of 6 major supply lines passed through or near a human-registered commercial interest. They were all civilian class. They were all fully compliant. They were all very polite. The new docking fees began accumulating. In the 8 weeks between the sanction and the emergency session, something happened in the archive rooms of Verith. 9, that had not happened in a very long time. Someone actually read the human historical record, not the summary. The Vreth had read the summary when humanity first achieved interstellar travel and had categorized them: young species, tribal tendencies, high aggression markers, likely to settle into standard developmental arc within 3 centuries. The summary was 11 pages, and had been filed alongside summaries of 40 other developing civilizations, and considered adequate. The full record had not been opened since. Sorath of the Ninth Coil opened it now. He had the kind of patience that only very old things have, not the patience of waiting for something you want, but the patience of a process that continues because stopping would require a reason, and stopping had not yet presented a reason. He sat in the archive room on the station's lower level and read. His translation matrix worked through the documents in chronological order. His coral bones were still. His 7 limbs were folded in the resting position. He read about the ice ages, the disease periods, the wars, so many wars, fought over land and water and belief, and the position of borders that meant nothing to anyone outside the borders. He read about the technology shifts, the way humans had taken every natural resource they had and burned through it, and then, at what looked like the absolute last moment before the whole thing fell apart, had found another way. And then another. And then another. He read about a period called the Second Collapse, when human civilization had contracted by 40% in population and 60% in technological capacity over the course of 50 years, and then had grown back, not to what it was, past what it was, into something different, something that had been compressed and then released, and was now moving with the energy of compression behind it. He read this pattern 3 times. Then he went looking for it in other species records. The Jessie had collapsed twice in their history. They had rebuilt, carefully, cautiously, in ways that looked backward first and forward second. The Palern had collapsed once and had required assistance from older civilizations to rebuild, which they had accepted gratefully, and which had created a debt structure that still shaped their diplomatic behavior 400 years later. No species, he found, had the pattern humanity had. The pattern was not resilience. Resilience was the wrong word. Resilience meant returning to what you were. This was something else. Every time humanity's back went to a wall, a real wall, an absolute limit of resources or survival or hope, something changed in the way they organized themselves and thought about problems. Not despair, not surrender, adaptation, but faster than biology could explain. They did it culturally. They passed the change from one person to the next the way they passed everything, through stories, through records, through the long chain of accumulated human stubbornness that said, this problem was solved by someone before you, and here is how they solved it. And here are the 17 other ways they tried first. They were, Sorath realized, the only species he had ever studied that treated catastrophe as a learning system. He sat with this for a long time. Then he looked at the current situation, at the freighters, at the fee schedules, at the very polite refusal to move. He looked at it the way he had just learned to look at humanity's history. He saw the pattern. The emergency session was not calm. The Vreth considered this unfortunate. Not because emotion was inappropriate, even the Vreth understood that some situations produce emotion, but because the specific kind of emotion filling the chamber was not useful. The Jessie delegates were using language that their diplomatic training should have corrected. The Palern were simultaneously seeking assurance that the situation would be resolved and preparing formal documents blaming the Jessie for the situation, in case it was not. The Dulkai, the youngest spacefaring species on the Council, barely 600 years of interstellar travel. Behind them were very quiet in the back of the chamber, which was somehow worse than the noise from the others. Sorath called the chamber to order. It took 4 attempts. When the room was finally quiet, he spoke. He spoke about the archive, about what he had found. He did not dramatize it. The Vreth did not do drama. He laid it out the way you lay out evidence, carefully, in the correct order, without editorializing. He said that humanity's behavior, over the course of their history, showed a consistent response to external pressure that differed from every other species in the galactic record. He said that every time humanity was pushed, truly pushed, to a real limit, they did not fight the way they were expected to fight. They found a different axis, a different layer, a different game entirely. And then they played that game with the full weight of everything they had learned from every previous time they had been pushed. He said that the sanction of diminishment had been designed to limit humanity's military capacity and their diplomatic standing. He said that humanity had responded by exercising their commercial capacity and their legal standing. He said that the gap between what the sanction addressed and what humanity was actually doing was not an accident. The chamber was very quiet. A Jesse delegate said that the freighters could be removed by force, that this was still an option, that the council had the military capacity to do it cleanly and quickly. Sorath said yes, that was true. He then asked the Jesse delegate to consider what humanity would do next, after the force, after the freighters were removed. Given what the archive showed about how humanity responds to external pressure, the Jesse delegate did not have an immediate answer. The Palern began preparing another document. Sorath looked around the chamber. At 43 species who had voted, 11 months ago, to diminish humanity, who had looked at a young, loud, aggressive civilization and seen a problem that needed containing. He had looked at the same civilization for 8 weeks. He had seen something else entirely. He said it quietly, because the Vreth did not raise their voice, but he said it clearly. And it moved through the chamber translation systems into 43 languages and landed in 43 sets of ears simultaneously. We did not provoke a nation, he said. We did not provoke an empire. We provoked the first species in the galactic record that fights like it has nothing to lose and plans like it will live forever. The chamber held that. Then someone asked the question that everyone in the room had been not asking for 8 weeks. What do they want? The answer arrived 11 minutes later through standard diplomatic channels, properly formatted, all fields correctly filled, reference numbers in order. It was from Delegate Yusra Okafor DA. It was addressed to the full council. It acknowledged the emergency session without explaining how she knew about it, which was its own kind of message. It thanked the council for their time. It expressed humanity's continued respect for the institutions and processes of the galactic community. And it informed the council that humanity was prepared to resolve the current situation through a new treaty framework, which was attached to the message as a document. 94 clauses, clear language, no diplomatic softening, no ceremonial vagueness. Every clause was a door that, once you walked through it, closed behind you. It was not a proposal. It was not a request. The last line of the cover message was 4 words. We look forward to your response. The Dual-Kai delegate in the back of the chamber read it twice. Then she said something quietly to the Dual-Kai delegate beside her, in their own language, not through the translation system. Sorath, whose translation matrix picked up Dual-Kai as a secondary language, heard it. She said, "They were always going to do this. We just gave them the occasion." Sorath looked down at the treaty document on his terminal. 94 clauses. He began to read. The freighters did not move. 3 weeks after the emergency session, 5 weeks after the sanction, the vessels sat in their positions with their lights on and their paperwork filed and their docking fees accumulating, the way interest accumulates slowly, then noticeably, then in a way that someone in a financial department somewhere was going to have to explain to someone in a budget department somewhere, and that conversation was going to be uncomfortable for everyone involved. More had arrived, not at the choke points. The choke points were already covered. The new freighters appeared at supply depots along the corridors, at maintenance platforms, at orbital stations that served as layover points for cargo moving between Tier 1 systems. Each new vessel filed its paperwork correctly. Each one introduced itself through standard communication channels. Each one sent a politely worded version of the revised fee schedule. Nobody shot at them. This was the part that the Jesse military command found most difficult to process. Their instinct and the Jesse were a species with very clear military instincts, honed over 600 years of space conflict, was to remove the obstruction, clear the corridor, restore order. But you cannot shoot at something that is doing nothing wrong. And the freighters were doing nothing wrong. Every morning, in the Council's logistics division, someone added the numbers up. The new totals were shared with the resource allocation teams of the 6 Tier 1 civilizations whose supply lines ran through the affected corridors. The resource allocation teams shared the numbers with their respective governments. The governments shared carefully worded versions of the numbers with the Council. Nobody used the word crisis. The word crisis implies something sudden. This was not sudden. This was slow, and it was precise, and it was getting worse at a rate that was entirely predictable, and that nobody had prepared for. Humanity had not blocked anything, had not damaged anything, had not threatened anyone. They had simply parked in places that mattered and waited to discuss the docking fees. 3,000 light-years from the supply corridors. In a small office on a Jesse intelligence station, an analyst named Orith Val was having a very bad month. He was 42 years old, which, for a Jesse, put him firmly in the middle of his career. He had spent 15 of those years working in signals intelligence, the monitoring and analysis of communication traffic across the sectors his station was responsible for. He was good at it, not exceptional, not the kind of analyst whose name gets attached to major discoveries, but solid and thorough, and the kind of person who noticed things that other people's reports walked past. He had noticed something. It had started as a small thing, an anomaly in the signal traffic logs from the years before humanity had achieved interstellar travel. He had been pulling historical data to build a baseline for a comparison report routine work, the kind of thing you assign yourself when the real work is slow, and the anomaly had appeared in the margins of a frequency analysis. Human communication signals had always been logged as noise. The early years of galactic contact with humanity had produced a flood of human communication traffic, radio, microwave, digital, eventually quantum encrypted. The sheer volume was unlike any first contact species in the record. Humans talked to each other constantly. They talked across distances. They talked between ships. They talked to recording devices in rooms where no one else was listening. The signals filled the monitoring bands like static, and they had been logged accordingly. Noise from a developing species with a cultural tendency toward high communication volume. Orith Val ran a new analysis on the old logs. He looked at the noise differently. He had a program he had built himself over many years, designed to find intentional patterns inside apparently random data. He had built it for a different purpose, looking for coded signals from hostile actors, but the mathematical framework was the same. He ran the program on 30 years of archived human communication traffic. Then he ran it again, because the result made no sense. The noise was not noise. Inside the volume of human communication, inside the casual conversations and entertainment broadcasts, and ship-to-ship chatter and all the rest of it, there was a pattern. Not a simple one. Not the kind of pattern that jumps out at you. The kind of pattern that requires a very specific set of tools to see, built by someone who is looking for exactly that kind of thing. Which was the point. The pattern was a communications architecture, not a separate network, not a parallel system you could identify and isolate. It lived inside the existing communication traffic the way a skeleton lives inside a body not visible from the outside, giving shape to everything. It had no center. It was distributed across so many frequencies, so many vessels, so many individual human communicators, that removing it would require removing all human communication entirely. You could not cut it. You could not blind it. The architecture had been built across 14 years of normal-seeming signal traffic, one small piece at a time, each piece invisible individually, the whole thing only visible if you knew precisely what you were looking for, and had the right tools, and enough time, and enough patience to run the analysis. Orith Val sat at his desk for a long time after the analysis finished. He thought about what it meant. He was a careful thinker, and he thought carefully. The architecture meant that humanity's communication system could not be disrupted. It meant that in any conflict, any attempt to isolate or blind human forces would fail at the point of execution, because the communication they needed was woven through traffic that could not be removed without removing everything. It meant that the 14 years of normal, logged, dismissed as noise human communication traffic had been, at least in part, the deliberate construction of a military asset that nobody had noticed because it was hidden in plain sight inside something everyone had decided was not worth looking at. He wrote a report. He was careful about how he wrote it. He used accurate language and cited his methodology clearly, and drew only the conclusions the data directly supported, without extrapolating further than he could prove. He filed it through the proper chain. Then he sat back and thought about whether he wanted to be promoted, because the report he had just filed was going to get a great deal of attention. And attention in intelligence work comes in two kinds. The kind where you found something useful, and the kind where you found something your superiors very much wished you hadn't. He was not sure yet which kind this was. The communication was secure. Audio only. No visual component. No location markers. No record in any official log. Yusra Okafor Ndiaye sat in a hotel room on a station whose name doesn't matter, and won't come up again. Admiral Priya Chen Vasquez sat in the facility that did not officially exist above Nairobi. Between them, the signal moved through 3 relay points and 1 authentication system and arrived clean on both ends. They had been doing this for 14 years. Vreth opened a back channel, Chen Vasquez said. I know. Yusra said. Silence. Not awkward silence. The silence of 2 people who do not waste words on each other because they have been doing this long enough to know which words are necessary. They want to negotiate, Chen Vasquez said. I know. You're not going to accept. Not yet. Chen Vasquez was eating. The sound came through the audio clearly. Rice. Probably. It was Thursday. The Jesse intelligence report is going to reach the council in the next 8 days, Chen Vasquez said. Orith Val is thorough. I know. That changes things. It changes what they think they know, Yusra said, which is what we needed it to change. Pause. How long? Chen Vasquez asked. Yusra was looking at something in her room, a window or a wall. The audio did not tell you which. Until they understand that negotiating with us means negotiating with us, she said. Not at us, not around us, not the way they've been doing it for 20 years, where they have the conversation they want to have and present us with the result. She paused. Until they understand what we are. Chen Vasquez chewed, swallowed. And what are we? The question was not a challenge. It was the question she asked at the end of every long operation, the check that made sure the person on the other end was still seeing clearly and had not drifted into the specific kind of certainty that stops being wisdom and starts being arrogance. Yusra said, the species that survived everything it met, including itself. The species that turned every wall into a door. The species that looked at a cage and spent 14 years building a key and then waited for someone to put us inside it. Chen Vasquez was quiet. We're what happens, Yusra said, when you assume that patience is the same as passivity. The line was quiet for a moment. I'll tell the freighters to stay polite, Chen Vasquez said. Please, Yusra said. In the archive room on Verith, 9. Sarath of the 9th Coil had been reading for 6 days. He slept less than he normally did. He ate at his terminal. His staff brought him things and he thanked them and sometimes consumed what they brought, and sometimes forgot. He moved through the human historical record the way water moves through a complex system, finding the path of least resistance, then finding it again when the path changed, then finding it again. He stopped on a file. A period of human history from the 20th century of their common era, a conflict they called the Second World War. He had read about it in the summary, 11 pages, years ago. He read the full account now. He read about a theater of that war called the Pacific, about the conduct of the conflict, about the philosophy that shaped how one of the major human powers approached the end of the war. He found a phrase. His translation matrix gave him the words in his own language, but the concept required him to sit with it for a long time before he was sure he was understanding it correctly. Unconditional surrender. Not negotiated peace. Not terms. Not the standard end-of-conflict framework that every civilized species had developed in one form or another, where both sides agreed to a set of conditions and the war ended at the point of agreement. Unconditional surrender meant the war ended when one side simply stopped having any conditions left to offer. It was not a tactic. It was not a strategy. It was a philosophy of the end of things. A statement that said, there is no deal here. There is only the complete cessation of your ability to refuse. Soreth read it twice. Then he looked at the 94-clause treaty document on his screen. He read it differently than he had read it the first time. The first time he had read it as a legal document, as a set of conditions humanity was proposing. The second time he read it as a statement. The coral in his bones a biological marker, involuntary, subtle as breathing. The thing that changed faintly in color when a Vreth's body registered stress turned the thinnest shade of white. He sat very still. Outside his window, a human freighter moved through the station's outer lane. Slow. Lights on. Every transponder active. Doing nothing wrong. He watched it until it was out of sight. Then he went back to reading. The chairs had been moved. This was the first thing the council members noticed when they entered the Chamber of Accord for the formal treaty session. The chamber had been arranged in the same configuration for 260 years. Long curved ring of council seats on a raised platform. Observation rows behind and below. The speaking position at the center, equidistant from all sides, which in practice meant equidistant from all the power in the room. Humanity's delegation had arrived 2 hours early. They had moved the chairs, not dramatically, not into a statement of dominance that anyone could point to as a provocation, simply into a different arrangement. The human delegation sat now at a table, a flat table, level with the council ring, not below it, and the council seats had been shifted slightly, so that no single position in the room had a higher physical elevation than any other. Nobody had stopped them. Nobody had thought to stop them because it had not occurred to anyone that someone would simply move the chairs. There was no protocol for it. The Vreth had designed the chamber over 3 centuries, had written procedures covering every aspect of session conduct from arrival order to speaking rotation to the acceptable formats for presenting documents, and not one of those procedures addressed the possibility that a delegation would show up 2 hours early and rearrange the furniture. The protocol gap now had a procedure. It would be filed tomorrow. Today, everyone sat at the same level. Soreth of the 9th Coil entered the chamber and saw the configuration and paused for less than a second. Then he took his seat. His face showed nothing. His bones, under his skin, were the faint white they had been for 6 days. The other delegates filed in. Their reactions varied. The Jesse senior delegate stiffened visibly but said nothing. The Palern immediately began composing what was clearly a formal note of objection, then stopped halfway through, then started again, then stopped. The Dulkai delegates in the back found their seats and looked at Yusra's table with something that was not quite admiration and was not quite fear, and sat somewhere between the two. Yusra was already seated. She had a folder in front of her. Inside the folder were 94 pages. She did not open it. She had not needed to open it for a long time. She had written it. She knew what it said. She waited for the chamber to settle. It took 11 minutes. Nobody marked the significance of the number. She spoke without preamble. No formal greeting, no acknowledgement of rank, no recitation of the session's official designation number. The Vreth would note this deviation in the session record and file it correctly. She let them. The Treaty of Pale Measure, she said, is on the table. It has been reviewed. You have had 3 weeks with it. I will take questions on substance, but the document is not open to revision. The Jesse senior delegate said that was not how treaty processes worked. Yusra said she was aware of that. She said it the way she had said everything for 20 years of diplomatic service. Clearly, without heat. The same tone that she used when explaining a medical procedure to a patient before surgery, precise, calm, leaving no space for the kind of ambiguity that lets people convince themselves they heard something different from what was said. The Jesse delegate asked what gave humanity the standing to present a non-negotiable document. Yusra said that humanity's commercial legal rights within galactic trade law gave them the standing to maintain their current operations in the supply corridors. She said that those operations were documented and registered and conducted in full compliance with existing law. She said that the existing law would continue to be followed for as long as the Treaty of Pale Measure remained unratified, and that her understanding of the current economic projections suggested this would become a significantly more pressing concern for the affected Tier 1 civilizations within the next 4 to 6 months. She said this without threat in her voice. It was not a threat. It was information. The Palern delegate asked for assurances that after the treaty was signed, humanity would reduce its commercial presence in the corridors. Yusra said the treaty covered this in Clause 37. The Palern delegate asked for additional verbal assurances. Yusra said Clause 37 was written clearly and that she was confident in the Palern legal team's ability to read it. The session ran for 4 hours, question after question, clause by clause, in the careful, systematic way that species who are looking for an exit that doesn't exist will work through a document. They were not looking for errors. They were looking for a version of the treaty that they could sign without feeling they had lost something. A version where the language was softer, where the shift in humanity's standing was framed differently, where the gap between what the sanction had said about humanity and what the treaty was now saying about humanity was less visible. Yusra answered every question in the language of the clause it addressed. She did not soften anything. She was not cruel about it. That was the part that was hardest to describe and that the Chamber's official record would not capture. She was not triumphant. She was not performing strength. She was simply doing the job the way it needed to be done, with the same quality of attention she had brought to surgery, and to 20 years of diplomacy, and to 14 years of something that had not had an official name until 3 weeks ago, when she had filed the treaty and given it one. The Dual-Kai delegate, the young one, the one who had said we just gave them the occasion, raised her hand partway through the session and asked a question that was not about a clause. She said, "What do you actually want from us?" The chamber went quiet. 43 species. The weight of 600 years of galactic governance between them, old certainties and older habits, and the long, comfortable assumption that the shape of power in the known galaxy was a settled thing. Yusra looked at her. The delegate was young by galactic standards, barely past the point where her species had figured out how to leave their own star system. Looking at Yusra, with the direct, unguarded expression of someone who had not yet learned to be diplomatic about asking direct questions. Yusra was quiet for a moment. "To be left alone," she said. The words were simple. The simplest thing she had said in 4 hours. "We always just wanted to be left alone." She said it without grief, and without anger, and without the weight of accusation. She said it the way you state a fact that you have carried for a long time, and have finally set down somewhere. To build, to explore, to solve the problems in front of us and then find new problems and solve those too. To be recognized as what we are. Not what we looked like when you first met us. Not what your models said we would become. What we are. She touched the treaty document. "This is what we are," she said. "Read it however you need to read it." The Vreth signed first. Sorith of the 9th Coil picked up the instrument and made the mark that his civilization had made on official documents for 1,000 years, and set it down and sat back and looked at the ceiling of the chamber he had worked in for most of his adult life. He did not look pleased. He did not look displeased. He looked like someone who has just understood something large and is deciding where to put it. The Jussie signed next, because not signing after the Vreth signed would have required a public statement of refusal. And the public statement would have required an explanation, and the explanation did not exist in a form anyone wanted to say aloud. After the Jussie, it moved faster. The Palaran signed with a formal note of concern attached, which was standard Palaran procedure for any document they had not personally drafted. The smaller species signed in clusters. The Dual-Kai delegate signed last among her group, and when she signed she looked across the table at Yusra, and Yusra looked back, and something passed between them that did not have a name in either of their languages. The last signature took 38 minutes to collect. When it was done, the chamber was quiet in a way that chambers rarely are, not the silence of waiting for something, but the silence of something having already changed, and the room catching up to it. Yusra closed the folder. She stood. She thanked the council in Vrethcord. Her pronunciation was the same as it had been 3 months ago, in the corridor after the sanction. Respectful mispronunciation, carefully delivered. She walked out. In the corridor, Dio was waiting. The same aide, the same corridor, different outcome. He did not ask what happened this time. He had been cleared now. He knew. He walked beside her toward the viewport at the end of the corridor, where space was the same dark it had always been, full of the same things that had not yet been decided. On the station's observation deck, Admiral Priya Chen Vasquez stood with a cup of something that the station cafeteria called coffee, and that bore coffee, a family resemblance, and nothing more. She had arrived on Verath 9 the day before. She had not attended the session. Her presence was not required in the chamber. Her presence had been required in the years before the chamber, in the facility above Nairobi, in the decisions about freighters and fee schedules and communication architectures that nobody noticed, until someone, very good at their job, spent a very bad month looking at old signal logs. She watched a human freighter drift through the outer lane, still there, lights on, polite. In a few days it would file the appropriate paperwork to depart. The docking fees would be settled at the new rate, because that rate was now written into the treaty in Clause 37. The freighter would leave, the others would follow. The supply corridors would return to their normal operation. Everything would look, from a distance, more or less like it had looked before, except that the document existed now, the signed document, in the official record, filed in the correct system, with the correct reference number, the document that took humanity from Tier 4 protected ward to something the treaty called co-sovereign participant, which was a new category because the category had not needed to exist before, and the very existence of the category told you something about what had just happened. Chin Vasquez drank her coffee. She thought about the question that had started all of it. The question 3 people in a room in Nairobi had asked 14 years ago, before the facility existed and before Pale Measure had a name. If we gave them a reason, a clean, legal, undeniable reason, would they actually do it? They had their answer. She looked out at the stars. The same stars that had watched humanity crawl out of its own atmosphere and figure out how to survive in the dark between them. The stars that had watched the ice ages and the plagues and the wars and the collapses and the rebuildings. The stars that had been there for all of it and had registered none of it and would be there long after humanity had become whatever it was going to become. She finished the coffee. Below her, in the corridor, Yusra Okafor Ndiaye was walking toward the viewport. Her pen was in her hand, the pen she had clicked in the chamber 3 months ago, when everything had finally become clear. She kept it, put it in her pocket. The galaxy had just learned what Earth had always known about itself. Not from any speech, not from any demonstration of firepower, from a species that had looked at a cage, studied it for 14 years, filed the correct paperwork, parked some very polite freighters in some carefully chosen places, and waited for 43 civilizations to do the math. The species that survived everything it ever met, including itself. The species that turns every wall into a door. The species that was never going to be anyone's ward. It had simply been waiting for someone to make it official. Now it was official. Now it was time to go home.